if you are interested, if you are perplexed by vagueness or by the liar paradox or by the Plato-Aristotle debate about getting knowledge from fiction, then you will definitely get a better understanding of what is at stake after going through this philosophical discussion.
So welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Manuel García-Carpintero. He is professor in the Department of Logic, History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Barcelona. His work has focused on a variety of issues in and related to the philosophy of language, such as fiction, assertion, proper names, presuppositions, quotation, and more. His books include Two-Dimensional Semantics with Joseph Macia, Empty Representations, Reference and Non-Existence with Genevieve Marti, and About Oneself, They Say Thought and Communication with Stephen Torre. I might have messed up some of those pronunciations, but apologize if I did. But yeah, and he also has a variety of published articles. So feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome, and thanks so much for being here, Professor García-Carpintero.
Good, thank you. Actually, the department is now called philosophy. We used to have different departments, and I was in this working department, but now we are all together, which is very good.
Yeah, good. I guess it's good. That's good correction. Yeah, I guess that what I had there was out of date, but yeah, nice. So today's interview is going to focus on issues relating to fiction, and like to those that are not so familiar with this topic, you might think that there isn't much to this for philosophical discussion, but I think this is pretty far from the case. Like, fiction is a huge and controversial subject in philosophy, and it's relevant to a wide range of philosophical issues such as truth and fiction, assertion, types of linguistic acts, proper names, singular reference, and so on. Empty terms, non-existent entities. Do you agree with the sentiment that fiction as a topic is prime for philosophical discussion? And what do you think of its importance?
Yeah, I fully agree with you. There is this Whitehead dictum that philosophy is just footnotes to Plato. From this, I like to think that if a topic is in Plato, it has very good chances to be a core topic in philosophy. I have been writing a lot, perhaps more than I would like to, on quotation, and that is probably not a core philosophical issue, although it relates to all those things that you mentioned, and it's interesting and important, but in itself is pretty marginal. I'm interested in fiction because it relates to these core issues, but for its own sake, and it's clear that it's a central topic in philosophy. Of all those things, what worried Plato, to put it in a simple way, but going to the heart of the issue, Plato was assuming that fictions convey truths, or are supposed, or are understood as if they meant to convey truths, which is something that ordinary people take for granted. So we criticize biopics. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they were criticizing this biopic about Elton John, Rocketman, because they gave too interesting but wrong explanation of his name and why he took this name, Elton John. They related it to Lennon, and apparently it has nothing to do with Lennon. And more seriously, Masha Gessen, an excellent writer. So she had a a piece in the New Yorker 1 or 2 years ago on maybe more on HBO show on Chernobyl, and so she said that it was very good, very well produced, and many things, but it was a lie. And so she was criticizing it because it was a lie, and this is fiction. So Plato was taking for granted that fictions are meant to convey truths, or at least some of them are. And he was worried because essentially he thought that fiction makers are not good candidates to trade on truths. So you cannot trust them for different reasons. This is a sentiment that many people have voiced afterwards. And even fictions, I mean, fictions on the assumption that they can convey truths, should be expected that they try to convey truths or at least suggestions about this very issue, why fictions can convey truths. And so, for instance, you have the way I see Mulholland Drive, this Lynch film, is as conveying the same kind of sentiment that Plato had, that fictions are the kind of thing, particularly some Hollywood films, that are prone to lead people to indulge in fantasizings of the wrong kind, fantasies that hide important truths about ethically, morally important truths about oneself. Anyway, so that was Plato. Aristotle afterwards had the opposite view. He had, I mean, both of them were speaking about poetry and poets, but I understand that they were discussing in a general way what we call fiction. So Aristotle argued just the opposite, that poetry is more philosophical than history, that you could have, as it were, deeper, more general truths. You can convey more general, deeper truths in fiction than in a history book. And anyway, so this is a clear philosophical topic because you can raise questions that perplex us, conceptual questions about the sort of core issues in philosophy. You can say, well, fiction is fiction. I mean, it's supposed to appeal to the imagination, to have us having a good time, imagining, fantasizing things. How could it be that you can expect to get truths from fiction? And so this is the philosophical, central philosophical question: how could it ever be possible that fictions convey truths that you can learn from them? The way that Plato thought that you could expect that, but you would be wrong if you think that is the case. And Aristotle thought the opposite. So I take this to be a central philosophical question. As you said, it's core philosophical question because it relates. For instance, you have to clarify yourself about what truth is, what knowledge is, to address this question, and this clearly are core philosophical topics. But the issue itself that I just described is clearly a conceptual conundrum. We can raise the question. The question obviously makes sense. We don't know immediately what is the answer. So it's a central topic for philosophical research, I would say.
Yeah, good. And I mean, it's just at least to me, an interesting question as well. I think a lot of people might find that, thought-provoking.
It's very good also because if you like fictions, then you could indulge in reading novels or watching films while thinking that you are doing that not for entertaining, but because it helps you to address to progress on your research. I'm just joking. That's not
that. Right. And then when you talk about these sort of truths in fiction like that, that's something distinct from like what's true in the fiction, or potentially distinct from what's true in the fiction?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there is truth in fiction in the sense that there are true and false characterization of fictions. So if I say that in Emma, in Jane Austen's Emma has 20 years and a few more, but not many. What I'm saying is true, because that is true in the fiction. The fiction is like that. And if I say that Emma is 30 something, what I say is wrong. But these are, I mean, and these are truth about the actual world, to the extent that Emma is an object in the actual world. It has a particular character, it has a content, it represents things in a certain way. It represents this Emma as having some features and not some other features that she may have had. And so those are truths or falsehoods about this object in the actual world. But it's not, I mean, most people would agree that there is truth in fiction in that sense, that fictions have particular contents. Maybe there is a lot of indeterminacy about which things are true, but some things are clearly true, correct descriptions of the content of fiction. Some other are false, incorrect. Manuel, we all would agree with her that there are good descriptions of the content of the HBO show Chernobyl, and wrong descriptions. But this is not what people have in mind. Is truth or falsehoods about the actual world that go beyond this characterization of what is going on in the fiction, and that you can somehow get from the fiction.
Right. Yeah, I mean, people might want to communicate certain truths about, like the human condition or whatever else.
Or the process of Chernobyl. The accident in Chernobyl, in the case of Masha Gessen, her claim is that the way the show represents, explains why the accident happened, is deeply wrong, because it makes it seem, and probably that is an accident of the way things have to be portrayed in a fiction show for it to be interesting. But it explains the accident as if it was the fault of some particular people. Something that could have been prevented by having better people, I mean, more efficient people in those positions. While she claims that this is deeply wrong, that this is the system, as it were. It's something more structural that explains what went wrong there. Anyway, so these are clearly propositions that go beyond what is true or false in the show. I mean, what the show represents as being the case. And she would agree that the show represents as being the case that this particular official and that particular official were responsible for. That is part of the content of the fiction. But that suggests, or she thinks that suggests that also in the actual world, the accident happened because some officials were not very efficient or whatever. And that, she thinks, is wrong. It's the same with Plato. I mean, it's not. He would be happy to agree that there are things that are true about the content of a given poem, but he would be deeply concerned about other things suggested by the poem to be true about the actual world.
Right. Yeah, good. And I did want to discuss some kind of general views of fiction, and something that's been fairly influential is called pretense theory. So basically, on the pretense approach to fiction, fiction making involves a sort of pretend. Writers or actors, etc. They're basically saying things as if they're asserting that such and such is true, but they're actually not doing that. They're not making that sort of assertion. Like when J.K. Rowling writes that Harry Potter is a wizard, she's not actually asserting that there was this person, Harry Potter, who is a wizard, but writes sort of as if she were doing so. Is this a fair description?
Yeah. This is a theory that Pretense theory is a theory that in analytic philosophy that originates with the work of Frege and Russell and Wittgenstein, is very popular and was very popular until, I would say, the most influential, the certainly most influential work on these topics, which is Kendall Walton's work. First articles, a series of articles in the 1970s, and then his great book, Mimesis and Make-Believe, from 1990. Until then, it was the standard view among philosophers. I mean, even Frege suggests this view already at the beginning. It's kind of natural when you think of literary fiction. I mean, the best presentation that I am familiar with of this view is in an article in the 1950s by an excellent Cambridge philosopher. Unfortunately, she died young, Margaret MacDonald. But then in the 1970s, John Searle re-articulated it in a much more influential article. But as I say, most philosophers took it for granted. I mean, John Austin, Saul Kripke, many people, I mean, most people. And it's kind of natural, as I said. I mean, Searle explicitly restricts his account to literary fictions. It's not just natural. There is some truth in it. I mean, so when actors on the stage utter a declarative sentence, it's natural to take the characters that they portray as making an assertion with that, in many cases, with that declarative sentence. And it's natural to see the actor as pretending to make. The actor himself is not making the assertion. The actor playing Hamlet is not making the assertion. Hamlet is making the assertion, and the actor is pretending to make the assertion. In pretending to be Hamlet, making the assertion. And it's kind of natural to think that something similar happens with authors. So when you read the Sherlock Holmes stories, they are supposed to be told by Sherlock's friend, Watson. They are narrated in the first person by one of the characters in the film, Watson. Of course, when Watson utters declarative sentences, he says, and then my friend Sherlock and I moved to Baker Street 227. So, 2 to 1, you're right. Watson is making this assertion, but it's natural to take Conan Doyle as pretending to be Watson in the same way that the actor that plays Hamlet pretends to be Hamlet, making an assertion. So Conan Doyle is equally, I mean, it's pretending to be Watson, making the assertion, while Conan Doyle is not making any assertion, he's just pretending. Pretending to be Watson, referring to a guy called Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle would be pretending to be. What I like about this picture is that it helps understanding. There is this deep fact about fiction, which is part of what worried Plato, which is that we have this feeling of immersion. It's very natural to get immersed in a fiction, where this immersion is the feeling that we are somehow present in that fictional world, that we are part of it, that these people especially think of TV shows that last for years. I mean, and you have this feeling that these characters are your friends and that they live nearby somehow in some part of the land. You could reach them and ask them how are things with them. This is what psychologists call immersion. And that could be explained in part by this pretense. So Watson makes assertions, fictionally makes assertions, and tells things in the way that when we make assertions, we provide information for people. And so by getting into this pretense, we have this feeling that there is this guy who is telling us things in the way things are really told to us in ordinary life. Anyway, I think that this would explain the motivation for this view. But it has the moment that you think about that, it has clear problems. So all these are things that Walton pointed out. So, for instance, we make fictions not just with words that are used for making these speech acts, assertions, or commands, or whatever. But we make fictions with images. Sometimes images without any words. In silent films or in Vermeer paintings, they are very narrative, and you could see that they are telling some kind of story, some part of it. They are giving you explicitly a part of a story, but you are supposed to imagine what went before and what will come out from what you are seeing in the painting. And so what is the assertion there? What is for there to be an assertion there, you have to imagine that the painting is given to you as a kind of documentary, and someone created that as a kind of documentary, which is at least it's not always very plausible. Maybe with some, but it requires some effort. Some other aspect of this is that for there to be a pretense of an assertion or a narration, there must be a narrator. And so in the case of the Sherlock Holmes stories, there is a narrator. In many fictions, there is a narrator who is a character in the fictional world. But in many others, there is no narrator. I mentioned Emma. In Emma, there is no narrator. So this view has to posit narrators everywhere, even when they are not at least explicitly there. And that creates tensions. And I would say that the main difficulty for this view is that is not that nobody can deny that fictions are created by pretense. I mentioned the theater. Obviously, there is pretense in the theater. The fiction is somehow conveyed in part by people pretending, and we can easily extend that to the case of fictions with explicit narrators. In the way I suggested, we can say that Conan Doyle was pretending to be Watson. No problem. It sounds very similar to what the actor does. But the question is, pretending for what? So many times we pretend for things that it would be a very long stretch to describe what we are doing in pretending as creating a fiction. So we pretend to mock our friends, to ridicule them somehow, be nicely friendly, in a friendly way. But is that a fiction? Or we can just pretend to clear up our voice. Are we creating a fiction in doing that? It would be a stretch to. So it's not that the pretense theory is wrong in the sense that fictions are not conveyed by pretense. Is that they are conveyed by pretense, but there is something more positive to be said about what a fiction is. I think that was and once you acknowledge that, and you come up with what that something else is, then it could be that you don't need the pretense thing. So you don't always need the pretense part. You can agree that in some cases, that positive part, that characterization of what making a fiction is, by itself suffices to produce a fiction without any pretense. And I think that we could find clear examples of that. Fictions that are not produced by any pretense that you are doing something else, that someone is doing some, is pretending to be someone narrating or telling us the fiction, but just directly conveyed by the fiction maker. We know all of these postmodern fictions in which for instance, Berman's Persona, which the fiction maker makes it clear all the time, gives you, it's making it clear that nobody is telling you anything, that it's he, the fiction maker, that is leading you to imagine things just by using all kind of techniques, like the reel breaks off several times during the projection. You see faces merging, faces of the two main actresses, or you even see the filming crew doing the making the film. So in these cases, at least these are clear cases in which the fiction maker is letting you know that he is just conveying a fiction without any kind of pretense. Anyway, so we would need to say, anybody would need to say something more positive. It's not mere pretense. It's pretending for a particular goal, or with a particular goal, for a particular purpose. And once you have that, then that leaves open. That is the only thing that is really essential. The pretense is just a good means of doing that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so like you can have so on the first step, maybe there's more to there is more to fiction than just mere pretense, and then maybe we can recognize that pretense isn't even essential to fiction. Is that what you're kind of getting at there? Right. Yeah, and you've discussed. I know David Lewis's view on pretense there is quite popular, or at least was quite influential. Of course, he had to think about it in terms of possible worlds and thinking about the scenario or the fiction as describing some possible world and asking what's true in that possible world, or some class of possible world of which those things are satisfied. Now, you sort of wrote in sort of defensively of this sort of approach, but I don't know. What broadly do you think of Lewis's approach to truth in fiction?
I mean, he had to come up with to describe so he was speaking directly about this issue that we talked about before, about truth in fiction, which is a very specific sort of discourse, as it were, in which we convey the content of a fiction. So it's not is when we say Emma has 20-something years, or she's a meddler, whatever. When we convey the content of the fiction, aiming to be accurate, not to say that. He was trying to convey, to account for the content of this very specific discourse. And as you said, he was doing that in this possible worlds, with this possible worlds metaphor, technique. I should say, as a kind of parenthetical here, I like that semantic technique for the following reason. I mean, I should say also that most contemporary linguists use it doesn't need to be the particular version. So here we would need to go into the technical details, how these things are modeled, and that would probably not be interesting. Luis thought of possible worlds as full things, I mean, full stories of the way the actual world went, sin superspecie eternitatis, as it were, the beginning and the end, if it has a beginning and an end, all that went on in the actual world, and any possible combination or variation that would be his possible worlds. And he also think of this as some physicists apparently do, as some real things. But you don't need any of this. I mean, you could, instead of the full histories, you could have smaller things, and I mean, you could just restrict the relevant possibilities that you are considering to some vocabulary that you have to describe that. And you don't need to think of these things as real in any way. It could be just good modeling techniques. Anyway, the reason I like that is that, so as I said, he was interested in characterizing the truth conditions or the semantics of these pieces of discourse in which we describe the content of fictions. And so we need some way of modeling contents. Emma has it that, and then Emma has 20 and something years, she's a meddler, she's whatever. So what are these contents? And so everybody wants these contents, and intuitively that is the case. We say that John said that, whatever we are providing the content of what John said. And we need these contents to be relatively abstract, in particular abstract from any specific language. I say John said that, and I can say that in English. But perhaps John was speaking in Basque, not in English. So when I say John said that, I'm not conveying that I say this in English, I'm not conveying that he was speaking in English. I'm using some accurate translation to English of what he said. So, and this is a way of ascribing content. And so we presuppose that these contents are abstract entities, abstract in the sense that the same content could be conveyed in different languages. But it would be good if, in principle at least, the same content could be conveyed not just in different, and these different languages could be very different, linguistically speaking. So some philosophers think of contents as having some structure similar to the linguistic structure, but that is very problematic because, so as I said, John could have been speaking in Basque, and I can tell you that the structure of Basque is deeply, the syntactic structure of Basque is deeply very different from the syntactic structure of English that I am using to convey. And nonetheless, I am assuming that the content is this abstract thing that could be the same thing, could be conveyed in Basque and in English. So it has to be very abstract. If you say that it has structure and the structure is linguistic, you are going to have difficulties because linguistic structure have linguistic structure, and the linguistic structures of different languages are deeply different. So you would perhaps find something more abstract, but it's not so clear what that more abstract structure could be. And the case of films and literary fictions or theater show that, in fact, it would be good if contents were even more abstract than anything linguistic. Because, of course, I mean, an image conveys thousands of words, but this could be a merely practical difficulty in principle. So it could be nice if, at least in principle, the same content that is conveyed with words in past or in English could be conveyed also with images or with actions on the stage, because then it would make sense to discuss to what extent an adaptation of a film into a literary work, or the other way around, or from any of them to the theater, are faithful or not. If contents are really abstract, then and so these possible worlds, metaphors, are ways of having contents that are really so abstract. I mean, they are just situations. I mean, in a way, they are just situations. Objects having properties, being in relation to other objects, these kind of things, and they have this virtue that they could be understood, so that in principle, a written work could in principle have the same content as an adaptation into the moving image. I guess that this is in part the reason why linguists, or all linguists working in semantics that I am familiar with, they use some variation of this sort of technique. Anyway, so that is something of what David Lewis assumed that I'm happy to grant. But he was led into, given his own assumptions, he was led into making this assumption about ubiquitous narrator, because he thought that the only way of properly characterizing in his way a content of a fiction would be to assume that that there is a possible world that we can imagine in which the fiction is conveyed truly. I mean, it's conveyed as an assertion. So someone is in the actual world. Conan Doyle is not asserting anything; it's just pretending. But then we imagine another world in which Watson, the guy whom Conan Doyle is playing, is really making those assertions. And most of them are true in that world, so that what Watson says obtains in that possible world. And it's in this way that we can capture what the content of a fiction is. But that requires that all fictions have narrators. The possible worlds in which the content of the fiction is realized, there is always someone saying the fiction. And that part, because of what I said before, is not right, I think.
Right.
I mean, apparently he has. I mean, I should say this is one. Also, the Serfly is one of the most influential works in the United tradition on these issues. And a few years after he wrote it, when he put it in his philosophical paper, he had a few postscripts, and in one of them, so he acknowledges the work of Walton. He very briefly, as far as I know, in a way that he didn't elaborate or develop, but he makes suggestions about how to modify what he says in the core of the paper in a more plausible, what for me would be a more plausible direction, without this assumption of ubiquitous narrators and ubiquitous pretense.
Right. I was thinking, I mean, there's a few issues that sometimes come up for pretense theories. I guess you're getting into some of them already. One thing that I've heard is that, people criticize this sort of view on the grounds that, I mean, it's not clear that when we engage in fictional discourse, there's this like hidden in the fiction operator or something like that. And yeah, I don't know. Do you think that a pretense theory is making certain assumptions about people's kind of linguistic intentions that might be wrong, or what do you think is the relevance of people's individual intentions when making these utterances to this sort of theory?
The pretense theory by itself, I don't think is committed to, for instance, to in the fiction operator. Luis seems, I'm not totally sure, but he seems to be committed to saying that when we do this specific form of discourse related to a fiction, because there are others. I mean, there is, for instance, the discourse of the fiction maker when it's a literary fiction. There, the fiction maker is not describing the content of the fiction; it's just giving the fiction to us. Although we can understand what the fiction maker is doing as also including some kind of operator, as if there was something like let's pretend that, or let's imagine that. And then, I mean, you can. Well, some people have defended these views, and they say that this "once upon a time" is just an abbreviation of this operator. And when there is no "once upon a time," is perhaps just the fact that the discourse is given in a book that has a novel or a fiction written somehow. Anyway, there is this other sort of discourse in which we describe the content of fictions, and there, as you said, they would assume that there is this kind of operator there, where we are saying something like in the Harry Potter stories, Harry Potter is a witch, or it's a whatever. It's studies in Hobart, or but that is not. I don't think that. Well, in fact, there are defenders of the pretense theory, like Pipke, that say that is not required. You could somehow take a contextualist approach. You can say that the context makes it clear that these sentences that you are using, they are not meant to convey an assertion about the actual world, but they are meant to convey an assertion about a particular fictional world, like the world of the Harry Potter stories, something like that. The issue of the operator is just an issue in linguistics about whether there are reasons to assume that whenever a sentence, which a declarative sentence, is given and it's clear that it's not meant to make an assertion about the actual world, there must somehow be some operator there that explicitly indicates that there are some views on which this is so. This is called a performative hypothesis in general. So you utter a declarative sentence that is not meant as an assertion, but perhaps as a promise. So there will be there is this view that somehow implicitly there is this operator. I hereby promise that, whatever. But there are other views that say that that could be merely contextually understood. It's not required that there is a specific operator. Yeah. So in summary, I don't think that by itself the pretense theory requires a commitment to that, even if David Lewis happened to buy both the Pretense theory, at least in the core of the paper, and the operator view.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. I just have to think about that a bit more. But I did want to talk about something else that's a big topic in fiction, which has to do with, well, fictional entities. And I take it that a lot of people working on fiction and truth in fiction, yourself included, wants to avoid Meinongianism. So this Meinongianism is the view, roughly speaking, that there are kind of non-existent entities. Harry Potter really is a thing, an object. Perhaps it's a sort of abstract object, not an actual person or concrete thing. What do you think about Meinongian approaches to fiction, and like why would you prefer to avoid it?
There are different senses of Meinongian, and it's not, as far as I know. I mean, I'm no expert in the history in this particular case. Apparently, it's not clear what Meinon himself meant. I was mentioning two forms of discourse about fiction. One, which is the one produced by the fiction maker, and another, which is our own discourse when we describe the content of the fiction. But then there are other. So that the difference between the two is, the main difference is intuitive difference, is that in the case in which we are describing the content of a fiction, this is clearly truth up discourse. What we say could be straightforward, true or false. As I was saying before, as I say, Emma is 20-something years old, I'm saying something that is straightforward true. If I say Emma is 30-something years old, I'm saying that something that is straightforward false. While in the case of Jane Austen, the discourse that Jane Austen herself produced, we don't feel intuitively inclined to describe that as truth up. She was not. We wouldn't locate ourselves behind her and say, "Well, but you are writing is false." It doesn't seem to be that kind of thing. But then there is other truth up discourse in which, and it's not so clear exactly how to understand these names like Emma, that names but intuitively don't refer to anything, at least to anything existing, to any existing human being. We could go out through all the archives and registers of women, 20-something, all women living in the 19th century, early 19th century England, and you are not going to find any Emma. But then there is this other discourse in which we say, like, well, Emma is a incredibly interesting and complex fictional character created by Jane Austen. And there it seems that we are referring to something. And so there is this version of Meinongianism. This is the way David Lewis uses the word Meinongian, which is anybody who thinks that there are these sentences that include these names, and they work exactly like when I say that Obama was an interesting character. This an interesting character. They are just referring to someone, and I ascribing a property to this entity. The same with what I just said about Emma is one of the most. It's a complex character created by Jane Austen. So I'm referring to something, and this something has this property of having been created by Jane Austen. That would be in a very general way Meinongianism. And then we also say this entity in some sense doesn't exist. That would be Meinongianism in general. But then this could be understood in a way that that is very clear. I mean, and not, it doesn't raise many concerns. I mean, it's very intuitive that we say that this Emma doesn't exist, but what we mean is that it doesn't exist in some restricted sense. Right? So it doesn't exist in the sense that it's not a real human being that you can find living in the early 19th century in England. But you are open to that thing being something. So something of a not complete, as it were, something that you cannot locate in space and time. So what that would be the most straightforward. So everybody would agree that Emma exists, that the work Emma, the novel, that exists, is something that Jane Austen created. And in some sense, so it has content, and the content could be this very abstract thing described in terms of these roles or situations or whatever. But then it also has, it was written in a particular language. It was written in English. So it has a, in addition to content, it has a vehicle for that content. And the vehicle itself is structured. It's English, and it has names and predicates. So it has parts. And so you could identify a part. So it's a word. We talk about the pretense theory, but we didn't talk about the alternatives that say that fictions are something for a more positive nature. But all these alternatives would say that fictions are a form of representation, a representational entity. And so the Emma, the work, is a representational entity. It has an abstract content, but it has a not so abstract vehicle. And in this case, a vehicle of words. Films, it would be an image vehicle. And through that vehicle, you can distinguish parts. These parts would be parts of the representation. So there is a part of the work Emma, which is the representation of this young girl with the features that are ascribed to her. And so you could say that when you say that you use the word Emma Woodhouse to ascribe to whatever it refers to, the property of being created by Jane Austen, you are just referring to that entity, that part of the whole work that Austen created. That would be an abstract entity. It's not something that you could find in the vicary registers in the 19th century, but it's an entity. It's just that it's not. So when you say that it doesn't exist, you mean that it doesn't exist as a human being. It doesn't exist as something located in space-time, in that sense, having human features. But of course, it exists in the same sense that the work exists. So this would be a form of Meinongianism that is very naturally understood and many people defend. Not I myself. I mean, I think that you don't need to even accept this form of realism about fictional characters. But at least this version of this general version of Meinongianism is. I don't have any problem in understanding it and finding it sensible somehow. And, so this is the view that people like Kripke or Baringwagen or Nathan Salmon have been defending. But then there is a more strict version of Meinongianism in which this more strict version really says that there are these things that don't exist, but somehow are. And this, so I'm very open to philosophical theories. But this one, I have problems in understanding because, so this is a point that Peter Baringwagen has been making over the years. There is this connection, conceptual connection, I would say, between the quantifier there is and existence. So, in the most general way, exist is a predicate that applies to everything that there is, and the other way around. Everything that there is such that it exists. It could be an abstract entity. It could be. So I find it difficult to make sense of this idea. That this is not to deny that people like Graham Priest have long a long way into making something like a view along these lines intelligible and even defensible somehow. But I still am not have a hard time making full sense of it. If something like a Meinongian view would be required then I would go with this more general view, the more general form of Meinongianism, which, you say, strictly speaking, Emma Woodhouse exists because there is something that is this character. It's an abstract entity, is part of this representation that is the full novel. When we say that it doesn't exist, what we mean is that we are somehow restricting our quantifiers. We are saying you will not find that among the human beings in a particular region of space-time.
Right. Yeah. The more modest view is just that there's maybe the abstract realm also includes these other the reference of names, I guess, and stuff like that.
Yeah. And it's very congenial for these Meinongians. These philosophers, millions, who think that the only meaning that proper names may have is a referent. So if you don't find a referent for a proper name, then the name should be intelligible. Then we will have difficulties in understanding how is it that we understand Emma Woodhouse when we read the fiction, for instance. So this is why Nathan Salmon, for instance, who is million philosophers, commits himself to this view, to this form of more modest form of Meinongianism. No, I was saying that. So there, if you are a million, if you think that the only meaning that proper names have, then you will find this more modest form of Meinongianism appealing, and you will use that to get a meaning for Emma Woodhouse in all its occurrences. For instance, including the discourse of Jane Austen herself, because otherwise, how is it that you understand the utterances that she produces? It's not that there is no alternative, but because Stefano Predelli who is a million. He has written recently a book in which I think that he provides the nicest articulation of this of a million view, capable of answering this worry. What is it that we understand when we read the fiction? If you get there these names that don't have meanings. Basically, what he says is that you can get information from utterances even when these utterances are gibberish and don't have meaning. You can, at least you can get information about the expressions that are being used, this kind of thing. And he goes a long way to making. But otherwise, you would have to go for something like this view. And so this is Nathan Salmon, for instance, has been promoting this form of defense of Meinongianism from the charge of what do you make of these empty names? Well, the names are not empty; they just refer to these abstract entities. It has a serious difficulty, this version, which if you think about that, because it's very different to say Emma Woodhouse is a fictional character created by Austen. There you are. It makes sense that you are referring to this entity, which is essentially a representation, a part of the novel, and you are saying of it something that is. It may well be true of it that it was created by Austen. That is a fictional character in that sense. You understand that meaning it's just part of a fiction. But then if you say that in the novel, when you are reading the novel, the name Emma Woodhouse also refers to these abstract entities, then it's very weird because in the novel it says that she is a woman, she is a young woman. And obviously, this character is not a young woman; it's a representation. It has no blood. It doesn't breathe. It's an it, not a she, for starters. And again, I mean, there are people who criticize this because it makes fictions to be nonsense. And to me, that is not a problem, because many fictions are nonsense in this sense. I mean, there is a famous Buster Keaton film called Sherlock Jr., in which a character enters into a screen and starts interacting with fictional characters. And we have Luigi Pirandello's 6 characters in search of an author. I mean, there are many of these fictions in which people interact with fictional characters in which so this is the nonsense that theories like Salmon requires us to engage, and it's clear that we can do that without much problem. It's weird, but we can somehow make sense of these impossible things. But still, the fact that there are these cases in which these things happen, it's very different. I mean, in cases in which it happens, we are aware of that, and we know that it's funny that these sort of things could. Well, it's not particularly postmodern, because I mentioned Buster Keaton. Woody Allen also has this the Purple Rose of Cairo, in which something similar happens. I suppose it's an homage to the Keaton film. We can make sense of that, but we find it funny. And Salmon's view is that requires that we should somehow find it funny everywhere. And we don't. I mean, precisely we have this contrast between these fictions that make use of this funny rhetorical trick and ordinary fictions, which we just... Anyway, if we had a way of understanding how Emma Woodhouse works in the fiction, that doesn't require us to say that it's always being used to ascribe to the entity properties that it cannot have. That would be much better. And that is offered by non-Meian theories, proper names that I think are independently much more plausible than this view that names merely the only meaning that they have is their reference. That is part of my reason for not liking this. Although I can make sense of this modest version of Meinongianism, but I don't find it particularly compelling.
Yeah, good. I've always found it difficult to sort of understand these views where, at least sometimes, the reference of certain names, like Emma Woodhouse or whatever, is some abstract object. It's like, no, if that denotes anything, if there is a reference to that name, it's a person. It's it's a flesh and blood conscious creature, something like that. I don't to say it's an abstract object is, just to me, to talk about something else. So I've kind of had difficulty. I think it's a common concern for this sort of approach. I mean, do you agree with that?
In general, when people make a case for this, like Van Wagen famously or Kripke in their works in the 1970s, they focus on this other discourse, which it's much more intuitive that we are speaking about these abstract entities. Like when we explicitly say Emma Woodhouse was created by Jane Austen, or it's a fictional character, or there we are saying, well, it's not a blood and flesh and blood thing, it's something else. So it makes sense that when philosophers try to defend this view, they focus on this form of discourse. But then they have to, because clearly this is, as it were, this is discourse as utter removed from the fictional. It's a derivative or secondary or a consequence of the discourse in which the fiction is created. So they should say something sensible about how this expression work in the fictional discourse itself. And there the theories are not very good. This is also in part what they have. They resort to this pretense, because then they can say, well, yeah, but that is mere pretense. There is no real reference. This pretend reference. And so I don't need to say anything about that. When this is questioned, as for the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning, when you say no, fiction making is a more positive, full-fledged representational activity that you have to properly characterize, then this whole building, this whole million buildings, in my view, breaks down.
Right. I had one more question on fictional entities. So last year I had the pleasure of talking with Graham Priest, and yeah, we discussed that among a bunch of other things. And he raised this interesting point, which is that sometimes we make sort of like mixed statements, statements concerning both fictional entities and non-fictional entities. And it's not easy to see how a pretense theory or other kind of related theories can make sense of that. So, for example, we had the statement like Mickey Mouse is more famous than Nancy Pelosi, or I like Harry Potter more than I like Donald Trump. How would we understand these on a pretense theory or some other theory that you would prefer?
Yeah, the kind of theory, there are different ways of making sense of that, but the kind of theory that I prefer appeals to presuppositions. So proper names don't merely have as a content, as it were, the object that they refer to. There is something else. There is some descriptive element that we presuppose in the same way that we presuppose criteria that we use to fix the referent, to fix the semantic value of other expressions, nouns like water, or indexicals like she. So there we refer to somebody, but we presuppose that this somebody is a salient female somehow in the context in which she is used. And with names, I would say that we are also presupposing that so there is this naming practice. We have this naming convention. We have somehow given somebody a particular name. So there is this practice of using a particular expression. Sherlock Holmes for an individual. Now, these presuppositions could be things that we believe to be true, but in some cases, I mean, so that this idea of a presupposition. So it's if you think of you compare an utterance of John came to visit. You compare that with it was John who came to visit. Intuitively, you get the same information from the two, but there is a difference. And the difference is that it was John who came, takes for granted or presupposes that someone came to visit. Takes for being already known, already familiar information that somebody came to visit. But you could find these two sentences in a fiction. And in the fiction, this information that it was John who came to visit, the information taken for granted, is not believed. So it's not because it's part of the fiction. So the idea is that the fiction has already established that someone came to visit. It's already true in the fiction by this point in which you encounter this, so that the presupposition need not be. I mean, if you are, if it is ordinary assertoric, straightforward assertoric discourse, the presupposition would be something that is already believed or taken for granted in the sense that it's supposed to be part of what we share with the information that we share. But if it is in the fiction, then it's also shared, but only in this imaginative sense. We already were imagining that somebody came to visit. Then we are giving for the information that this person was John. So I would say that the same happens with names. So typically when we use them in ordinary discourse, when I say Kripke published a paper on this in 1970, I take for granted that there is this person who bears this name. So there is this practice of having someone having been given the name Saul Kripke. And there is this person who bears this name. I'm taking that for granted. That I believe that. Not only I believe that, I take it to be shared information. And the same happens in a fiction. It's just that the information in question is not believed. It's just part of what we are taking for granted, imagining in this in this project of dealing with this fiction. So I would say, so this sort of view, which can be, I like this presuppositional way of spelling it out, because going back to this the issues that we discussed at the beginning, some of the interest of working in fiction is that there you can try theories of more general issues like language, names, and that is part of the reason. And so I'm interested in how referential expressions work in general, and so it's nice to try to see whether a general view about that works in the case of fiction. So that is part of that. And I think that this presuppositional view provides a much better account of how we use referential expressions like names than millions in general. But then it nicely applies to these cases. You only need to take into, you say Sherlock Holmes was much more intelligent than Trump. So you are taking for granted that there is this guy who bear this name, Sherlock Holmes. There is this naming practice created by, it happens, well, there is the other for Donald Trump, and they both pick out an entity. It's just that these presuppositions, in the case of Trump, are belief, and in the case of Sherlock Holmes, are merely imagined. So, to the extent that there is this practice of having this name, it was the practice was created by Conan Doyle, pretending that there was already a practice, but we know that there was not the case. It was created by him. So we indulge in that pretense. We pretend with him that there is a human being, very intelligent detective called by that name. We don't believe this, but we imagine that as part of this pretense characterized in this more positive way. In the case of Trump, the same. It's just that the presupposition is something that we do believe. But semantically speaking, the things work smoothly in the same way. It's just that when we do a formal, precise, semantic representation of what is going on, we have to complicate things, as it were. So the semanticists speak of a common ground. The common ground should be distinguished. And there is the common ground constituted by what we commonly believe, the beliefs that we take to be shared. But there are also parts of the common ground which are not belief, are just what we are imagining as part of our common way of dealing with a fiction, like Holmes stories. Well, in a brief nutshell, that is, there are formal models that elaborate or articulate this sort of view in a nice way. They are complicated but in a nutshell, the idea is this: that we are just doing what we do with proper names. We are presupposing that there is a naming practice, and the naming practice picks out, in this case, two human beings. But in one case, the presupposition is part of a pretense, if you want. It's part of something that we imagine, but we don't believe. And in the other case, it's not just something that we imagine, it's something that we do believe. Yeah, that makes this I like, because it makes perfect sense of these comparisons that we make. Of course, Graham Priest thinks that his orthodox Meinongian view makes better sense of that, because we are just comparing two concrete objects, Trump and Holmes, in my example. It's just that one exists and the other doesn't. But aside from that, they are just two concrete entities that can be compared for intelligence. And as I said, I mean, I cannot really make good sense of these non-existent things that nonetheless has some degree of intelligence, so that you can compare that degree of intelligence to the degree of intelligence of Trump. I cannot really make sense. No matter. I mean, acknowledging the strong effort that Priest puts into making it intelligible. Yeah.
I mean, if we said Sherlock Holmes is like shorter than Donald Trump, how are we to make sense of that if the things that we're comparing are Donald Trump and this non-existent entity? What height does it have such that it's shorter than Donald Trump? I don't know. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Yeah, if you've had the modest Meinongianism, it's clearly you have this problem, because we are comparing an abstract entity, part of the representation that the Sherlock Holmes stories are, with a human being. And how can you compare these two things for shortness? But Meinongians, Orthodox Meinongians, have a similar problem, because even if they call the relevant entities concrete, they still are not in space and time. And I mean, at least I don't have a clear grasp of what these properties, like being short, how they apply or are supposed to apply to these non-existing entities. Yeah, and on the other side, I mean, this is what we always have in philosophy. We have, in that sense, it's like science. I mean, it's adaptive. There is this alternative that I just describe briefly, but I think is perfectly intelligible, and it can be formally articulated in a very precise way, and you don't need to say any of these things. You say, yeah, Sherlock Holmes is a straightforward name. It has the required presuppositions that are needed to make sense of it, to give it a meaning. It happens that the relevant descriptions don't pick out anything, so it doesn't have a reference. But it doesn't need to have a reference for it to be intelligible, because you only need to suppose, imagine, however you take it as part of the pretense, if you want to speak in that way, that the name picks out an intelligent human being.
Right. Yeah. Good. Yeah, that makes more sense to me than some of these Meinongian or abstract alternatives. I did want to get your thoughts on some sort of general approach that I have to truth in fiction. So I would want to broaden the notion of sort of truth to likelihood. So what is a likelihood that some statement concerning a fiction is true, or given the statements in the fiction and the sort of unstated background assumptions? So in other words, we can ask, given the explicit and implicit statements involved in some fiction F, how likely is it that phi? In the case where the answer is 1 or nearly 1, maybe we say just phi is true in F, or and just drop talk about probability. But I think this can potentially provide some powerful, useful apparatus. We're talking about truth in fiction. Doesn't involve any talk about possible worlds. I think we can also handle cases concerning inconsistent fictions pretty well. I don't know. This is sort of a rough first pass, but do you understand and what do you think about this kind of approach?
Yeah. So this leads us back to this article by David Lewis and its importance. Its importance. I mean, I said that he was focusing on this very specific form of discourse about fiction, in which we say we make straightforwardly true or false statements about the content of fictions. A friend has gone to the movies and we haven't seen the movie, and we ask, what is that about? What goes on in there? And then the friend provides a characterization of what is going on there. So it seems to be clear. I mean, something that I like, among many other things in the philosophy of David Lewis, is that he was very uncommittal. I mean, he just wanted to. He considered different philosophical views that people have, and then he offered ways of analyzing all of them without committing himself to any of them being the one. So intuitively, for many people, a problem here is that there is the content that is somehow explicit in the fiction. So if the fiction is a film, things that you can see, quotation marks, but you can see on the screen. If it is a literary fiction, things that are conveyed perhaps by this explicit narrator, by being explicitly articulated in a sentence by the narrator. But then intuitively, there are many other contents that are not explicit in the fiction. So we say that when we describe the content of fictions, we ascribe to the fictions contents that are not, cannot find any, if it is a literary fiction, any sentence that articulates that. If it is a film, they don't happen. So, sometimes people, to illustrate this, they give trivial examples, like the fact that Sherlock Holmes has a heart or a liver. But they are non-trivial cases that so there is this film by Almodovar called Talk About Her, and one of the crucial aspects of the content of this film is that there is a rape by one of the main characters, Benigno, but this rape is not shown on the screen. We don't see that. But nonetheless, it's part of the content of the film that there is this rape. And well, the same can be said about many literary fictions. Usually, to illustrate, to discuss these issues, I use a very short story by Julio Cortázar, this Argentinian writer. This just half a page. It's called Continuity of Parts. And the crucial content there, so this is a story about a reader who gets immersed in a fiction, so there is a fiction inside the fiction. But then when we read it and understand it, my 12 years old daughter probably she will not get it, but when you read it, you get surprised by the end and you go back to the, so you will see that this reader is reading a novel, and the things that we are told he's reading in the novel, in fact, are happening around him. And they are happening around him in a way that the sudden ending means that this reader is being killed, given a plot that is the plot that he's reading in the novel. So, anyway, this is not said, but is the crucial aspect of the content. Nonetheless, Luis says that, well, there is these people who don't tire of telling us that don't read in fictions more than what is explicit there. And in fact, there is a philosopher, at least, who has articulated this view. He calls it explicitism. And so David Luiz offers an account of truth in fiction for explicitism. But then he says, well, this is a view, but it's not very popular, or it's not very intuitive because of, for instance, that consideration that they offer. And then he goes on to provide two different ways of explaining how is it that we go beyond what is explicit in the content. In what is explicit, what is explicitly seen on the screen or explicitly said in the page. Anyway, one of the two, he considers two possibilities. I'm not going to go into. One of them appeals to what is real, to what happens in the actual world. So the idea is that we infer on the basis of what we are explicitly told, plus what we know, or what is not, whether or not we know it. I mean, something is true in the fiction to the extent that it can be inferred, given how the actual world is, on the basis of what is explicitly articulated in the fiction. That is one of the views. So this has the consequence that everything that is real, even if it was not known when the fiction was produced, is part of the fiction, which is consistent, as David Lewis says, with many critical practices. So, on the assumption that Freud theories are correct, then literary critics wonder whether Hamlet had the Oedipus complex. Shakespeare didn't know anything about this, and no reader of Shakespeare at the time could have known about this. But if what makes for an inference to be correct about what the implicit content of fictions is what is true in reality, then we may wonder whether it can be inferred from what we explicitly have about Hamlet's behavior that he had this Freudian complex. But if you don't like that, then Lewis offers you another possibility in which you don't infer on the basis of what is true in the real world, but on the basis of what is generally believed at the time at which the fiction was created, as it were, by Shakespeare and the audience that Shakespeare had in mind, or something like that. Anyway, I take it that this appeal to probability that you mentioned is a way of rephrasing this appeal to reality, to the reality principle, as it is called. So instead, or is perhaps merging the two things, depending on how you understand probable.
It's sort of when I was thinking about the implicit statements involved in the fiction, I am including some of those might be just like things we're taking for granted in the fiction because there are things true of the actual world, you know, that the characters have normal organs, whatever else.
Yeah.
But in terms of probability, specifically, it's just having to do with, you know, conditional probability of like what's likely given these statements and so on. Although some of those statements are going to include things that we take to be true in the fiction because they're true of the actual world.
I mean, this has been something like this has been suggested to people, and perhaps I mean, this is one of the main discussions, contemporary discussions about this, and many of them originated in David Lewis's paper, which explains what manifests how influential it was. But it's about how to properly articulate these principles that make for implicit content, and proposals like this. Let me just, I mean, we in the end we didn't go into the positive theories of fictionality, but so the explicitists, as they know, they have a clear problem, which is that not everything that is explicit in a fiction is true in the fiction, because sometimes the narrators, so there is an explicit narrator, but the narrator is unreliable. Some of the things that or the same, well, this happens, for instance, in Nabokov's Pale Fire. So there is this Kimbo narrator, and it's clear, it should be clear to any competent reader that he's Trumpian, that he has this narcissistic personality syndrome, and many of the things that he says, particularly when they involve he and his status, and they are wrong. They're factually wrong. So they are explicitly said, but they are not true in the fiction. There is a famous case in films, film by Hitchcock, film called Stage Fright. There is, so we are led to, because what is shown explicitly in the screen, on the screen, we are led to think something that is not the case. It's not part of the fiction, as we discover at the end. So not everything that is explicit. So you have to get some kind of explanation for why some things that are explicitly said are not true in the fiction. What they represent are not true in the fiction. What you need for that is a theory of fictionality. And the same applies to all these principles, no matter how you articulate them. So if you have a realist fiction, probably the inferences that give you these implicit contents rely on some version of this reality principle, and perhaps a version in terms of probabilities is better than a straightforward appeal to what is true in the actual world, or the way Lewis does, appealing to counterfactuals based on this reality principle. So I grant that in those cases, probability version probably is better. But then you have a very unrealistic fictions. There are those for which this idea that fiction can be explained in terms of pretense is more clearly problematic. And so the case I mentioned of this story by Cortázar is a clear case of that, because the content is totally improbable. It's not. Some people say that it's impossible. It's not impossible. It could be that someone who is in the known of this plot for killing the reader of the novel has written the novel to warn him somehow, and the reader is reading the novel precisely at the same time that what is told allegedly fictionally in the novel is going on. It's really happening around him. But all of this is so improbable. I mean, you wouldn't ever infer that on the basis of any appeal to probability. If you appeal to probability or to reality principle or anything, you would just give up. You say, I don't understand what. And nonetheless, any reader will come out with well, like 15 years old and beyond, immediately get this core fictional content which is implicit there. And this is because, well, they are tacitly. So, well, a good theory of fictionality should explain that. So the idea here is that fiction makers are trying to give you an interesting story, something interesting to imagine. And in some cases, they rely on what is more probable for that, because that is, for instance, science fiction, which tries to really make predictions about what may happen in the actual world. And so Robinson's novels. So they must rely on something like an appeal to probability, because to make for an interesting story, because the story is interesting to the extent that it's really giving us something that could easily happen in the actual world. So they are somehow relying on probability. But in the Cortázar story, that is not the game. The game is to shock us by making us imagine something which is very unexpected, and nonetheless we can come up with it or something like that. So to make it short, as a general principle, I don't think it would work unless you restrict it by placing it in a proper account of fictionality that is able to explain also, for instance, why the things that unreliable narrators tell us are not true in the fiction. Are not because it's because because for the story to be really interesting in this particular case, we should gather that this is not true in the fiction. This is just megalomaniac indulgences of this crazy narrator.
Yeah, good. I didn't really have in mind a very strong reality principle. I didn't really spell it out either. I guess the idea is that there's some details that that the author wants to fill in kind of implicitly to the fiction. We're not trying to match the fictional world as closely as possible or something to the actual world necessarily. It's just that there's some details that are sort of taken for granted in the fiction, but not stated explicitly, because something like this is going on where the author is assuming certain facts about the actual world, and that the audience would make similar assumptions in their interpretation of the fiction. Again, that people have organs or whatever else, might be in the fiction, but not trying to match it as closely as possible to the actual world in all respects. And then we can go from there and ask, okay, given the explicit and some of these implicit assumptions in the fiction, it might be sort of vague with exactly what's included, but
no, I mean, I don't remember now the authors, but I remember reading 2 or 3 articles which the authors were defending a kind of future probability as opposed to the sort of view that Lewis articulates, and they gave very convincing examples with something like a principle along those lines. For those cases, would be much better.
All right. Yeah, at least I think it's this interesting, maybe worth exploring. I don't know. I do want to cover a couple more questions before we wrap up. You've talked a bit already about proper names and proper names in fiction, and you had this interesting article concerning the co-identification of names, where names like co-refer or in fiction. And it can be tricky because on some views, like, wait a minute, how can they don't refer to anything? So in what sense are they co-identified? Maybe you could elaborate on this, but I understood your account as saying something like, two names co-identify in some fiction if, according to the reference fixing presuppositions of that fiction, they pick out the same object in that fiction. So, for example, if the name Superman picks out a person identified in a particular way in the Superman fiction, and the name Clark Kent does so as well, and they're co-identified, the names are co-identified because in that fiction, the same person satisfies both reference fixing descriptions, then we can talk of them as being co-identified, if that makes sense. I mean, is this right? Is that close to what you would say? Can you expand on the...
This is again, one more reason for me to like this presuppositional account of referential expressions, reference fixing in general, in particular in the case of names, that it nicely, without only by taking into consideration that the presuppositions in question are believed in the ordinary case, but merely imagined in the fiction case. Only by taking that into consideration, that we have to split, as it were, what is called the common ground, what we are taking for granted in the sense that we believe that in the default case, but taking for granted in the sense that we are merely imagining that in going along with this fiction. Merely taking that into consideration, the machinery is the same. And, so co-identification is something totally standard. So it's just anaphoric reference. So many times when I say he, sometimes this is deictic and I point to someone salient, but other times it's clear that I'm just meaning to mean the expression to co-refer, to pick out the same semantic value that a previous expression had, another pronoun or a name or a description. A student came to visit this afternoon. He was really distressed. So he is anaphoric with respect to a student. This is just co-identification. When we use proper names, of course, I mean, as I said, the reference fixing presupposition has to do with a particular naming practice relating to a particular baptism, not with a shape, because many people are all the same, with the same. I mean, there are not many, but there are other Manuel García-Carpintero in the world. Yeah. So it's my name, the one that was started to be used when my parents gave me that name. And it's that is appealed to in this reference fixing description. But so, and many times, because you are speaking about people who are referred to with names with the same shape, you have to take care of separating the different naming practices assumed. But otherwise, this is what we do when through a discourse. We use the same proper name, unless these cases in which there are two different Davids involved, and you have to be careful. You have to say that David, this other David. Then it's taken for granted that there is this anaphoric connection, that each new use co-refers with the previous ones, because the reference is supposed to be fixed by the same naming practice. And sometimes that happens with different names, with different shapes. So most of my friends call me Manolo, not Manuel, because there is this practice in Spanish of using Manolo as a variant, nickname variant of Manuel. So you can translate all of this to fictions. So the difference is that the alleged baptism didn't happen. In fact, it was Conan Doyle. Conan Doyle pretends that there is this Sherlock Holmes naming practice, but in fact, the real one, the one that we go along with, was introduced by him implicitly in creating the novels. But then he could pick it out so he wrote a short novel. I think it was Studying Scarlet, the first one. But then he put the name was already instituted, created really not just in the Pretense, but by his giving this character that name, and then he could pick it out later, in other novels, and it would co-refer, and I can pick it out to describe the content of the novel. So what is going on here is exactly the same as if this was just ordinary, straightforward, assertoric discourse, informative discourse about Trump and his shenanigans. The only thing is to keep present that this common ground that validates the presuppositions that we make doesn't need to be something that we believe. It could be, it must include, to make sense of the use of language of these devices in fictions. We have to take into consideration that sometimes what we are taking for granted is not things that we believe, but things that we are imagining as part of this project of engaging with these fictions. So that is what I try to do in that paper, to show that you can make sense of co-identification, why in the fiction Clark Kent and Superman are supposed to co-identify. This is just a variant of Manolo Manuel in the case. It's not nickname in the standard way, but the way it works in the fiction. And it extends beyond the fiction, because when we use these names to describe the content of the fiction, we are just going along with. We are just doing the same. It's just that we don't take for granted that we don't really believe that that there is a person who was given that name. That was just a pretense. If you want to speak that way, it was a fictional character that was given a name, Clark Kent Superman.
Yeah, good. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And although I could cover some more stuff on that, I want to ask another question related to propositions and propositions in their relevance to fiction, because I know you've done some work on propositions generally, and how they might be, how our thinking about propositions might be relevant to our thinking about fiction. And one issue you've explored is that, well, there's this concern that certain accounts of propositions, they might run into troubles with like cancellation and pretense and fictional discourse. So I don't know. Do you mind talking about how views could run into some problems here, or what your general approach to propositions is?
My general approach is this traditional one, in this particular case that I mentioned at the beginning. I mean, that article that you mentioned, I was trying to reply to fashionable theory that tries to, I mean, in the traditional Austinian and Searlean picture of these things, Frege, in fact, has this. So there is this distinction between content and force. So we assert, we order, we promise, and these would be different illocutionary forces, different things that we do with contents, different representational activities, and then these representational activities necessarily have contents. But things are different in the sense that the same content could be promised and asserted. And of course, you could assert different contents. So it's in this sense that we need to distinguish. Perhaps in the wild, you don't find just propositions or just forces. The two things need to be together, but analytically, we need to distinguish them because of this. And the content should be as abstract as possible because of the reasons that I was given at the beginning. That we want the same contents to be contents of expressions in different languages, very different languages, and even very different media, like images and words. So that is my view. There, I was not. I think that this makes perfect sense. This is the view that I try to. Fiction could be just one of these illocutionary forces, or representational types. So different, the same kind of thing that promises, or to assert is, or to order is. So these things are supposed to be characterized essentially in terms of what they are for, what their point or role or function, what they are supposed to be good for. Then fiction should be described in this along the same lines, but of course in a way that makes it different from promising or asserting or ordering. But it's a representational activity with a positive characterization, in contrast with what the pretense theory tries to say. But then aside from that, we should distinguish forces from contents in this analytic way that Frege arguing for. And then there are these fashionable theories in which they try to put together the two things so they have difficulties. So this is something that people like Peter Hans or Scott Soames or my friend Francois Recanati defend. And so the particular Recanati wants to say that you cannot separate content from assertoric force, and Hans also calls this predication. So all contents come necessarily with this assertoric force. But then, of course, in fiction, the contents are not asserted, or when you have a content in the antecedent of the conditional, that is not asserted. You are not committed to the truth of that. And then they have to say something about that, and they appeal to this operation of cancellation. Well, I try to say that the case of fiction is good for that, because there is no reason for thinking that that goes back to what we were discussing before about narrators, and so the defender of this view is committed to saying that all fictions are conveyed in this way, that there is a pretense of an assertion, and then there is an assertion, and then it's made clear that it was just a pretense that there was this assertion. And as I said at the beginning, I think that this is a good description of what goes on in cases in which there is an explicit narrator. In the literary case, it's a good description, even in cases in which there is no explicit narrator. But there are good reasons for us to think that the discourse somehow, because the fiction is clearly realistic and there is this phenomenon of immersion, and so there are good reasons in these cases to assume that, there is also an implicit narrator who pretending to make an assertions, but there is no reason to say that this is always what is going on. So if you think of fiction making as a representational activity of its own, then it's perfectly expectable that you will find cases in which it's just directly conveyed that a content is put forward not as an assertion and not without any pretense of an assertion being cancelled, but directly for fiction making. I mentioned these cases in which, like the Berman's persona, or this story by Cortázar that I was mentioning before, it doesn't make sense to think that there is any pretense of asserting anything there. It's totally crazy seeing in that way the content. The natural thing to say, no, this guy is trying to give me a nice story to imagine. And it doesn't matter that this is totally implausible, improbable, it never happened. Putting this just half a page, it makes for very interesting imagining. So I like it. that is again the objection that I raised for this cancellation idea is this, that there is this assumption that there must be an assertion at the core of any presentation of a content, and there is no reason that I can see to think that.
Yeah, I've heard people say that, maybe what we should say about fiction is that people are just saying a lot of falsehoods, even though they don't actually believe them. That seems like a really strange thing to say, is if they really are asserting these things, they just don't actually believe it. I don't know.
Yeah, this is the same idea. and it seems wrong precisely because, yeah, it makes sense in many cases. There are good reasons to think that this is what is going on. There is a pretense of providing Don Quixote is like that. And there is the pretense of giving us information about something that happened. That could be psychologically important because psychologists have interesting things to say about this, about what psychologically goes on when we engage with fiction. And as I mentioned, how this immersion or transportation to the fictional world is produced could be a good psychologically good recourse for producing this effect that Cervantes pretends to have obtained this manuscript, which somebody who knew about Don Quixote tells us about the things that he did. But that is not required by the nature of what if. So if fiction making is a representational activity of its own, like promising or ordering, there is no reason why, in order for you to order, you should put a content with assertoric force and then cancel that. Or in order for you to promise something, you should put forward a content with assertoric force and then cancel that to say, well, I'm not saying that this is the case, I'm just committing myself to this, to making this the case in the future. There is no reason for that. That means we just have this positively characterized, non-derivative, primitive, basic activity of promising, which is as basic and primitive as asserting or ordering, and it can be done on its own independently. So the same about fiction. This is essentially, this is one of the main claims that Walton have been making from the beginning. There is nothing derivative about fiction. It's just a representational activity of its own, with its own features and characteristics. It can be done by pretending to do other things, but it can be done by itself on its own. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. So yeah, so I don't want to I don't want to keep you all day. So I do like to end with a kind of general meta philosophical question. So what do you think is the value of philosophy? Why do you find it worth doing?
I mean, people doing conscious studies, they have this phenomenal contrast paradigm. To say you can see, yes, appealing to your own phenomenology, you can see that there is a contrast. For instance, you hear something that you don't understand, they give you a sentence. It turns out to be a sentence in a language that you understand, but is disguised in such a way that you don't discern what the words are. And then the mask is somehow progressively eliminated, and in the end you understand the words, and then you understand the meaning immediately. So you can see that there is a phenomenal contrast between. So this is one of considerations that is being used to saying that there is something like a cognitive phenomenology. There is a phenomenology of understanding, not just sensory phenomenology that we all grant that there is the difference between seeing red and seeing green. So it's the same with philosophy. I would say. So there was a time when some of Kripke's writings, he was saying, unfortunately, we don't have any theory of vagueness. That was before 1975. So I remember myself thinking about vagueness, reading Frege and so, and phenomenology. I bet that my situation is like Kripke's when he wrote this. But then Kit Fine came along in 1975. He published this paper on vagueness using supervaluationist techniques. So you read that. Maybe you are not convinced by that theory in particular. Or in fact, it's much better if you can explore different theories that emphasize that theory has consequences. But you compare your phenomenological state before you consider the puzzle of vagueness before going through these papers and afterwards, and it's clear that there is a gain in understanding that is phenomenologically manifest. Maybe you don't have a theory of vagueness, but you could point out what the problem is, why you cannot say this, because, or at least you cannot say this without saying more because you have this problem. So it could be the same here with. We could say exactly the same. So at least this is, I asked my students, I teach a course for last year undergraduates on these issues. And I asked them these questions about Plato and Aristotle at the beginning, or truth in fiction, or this Machiavellism. So compare your state before reading all these people that have written very nice things on this: Walton, Greg Curry, Kripke, Wagen. Compare your understanding situation before and after, and I think there is a clear-cut gain in understanding. So, I mean, I understand that many people don't care about conceptual understanding, getting clear about our concepts. They care more about practical life and real things and action. But some other people do care about, as it were, using words properly. For using words properly, you should have as good a reflective understanding of what these words, in particular these big words like truth, knowledge, meaning, fiction, which concepts they convey. And I think that I think it's clear that philosophy. So they say that there is no progress because we still have all these theories, and maybe we still have the same problems as about fiction that Plato and Aristotle. This same confrontation. We could mention people who are on the side of Plato and people who are on the side of Aristotle nowadays. But this forgets that the real gain is in understanding the issues. And, you definitely, if you are interested, if you are perplexed by vagueness or by the Liar paradox or by the Plato Aristotle debate about getting knowledge from fiction, then you will definitely get a better understanding of what is at stake after going through these philosophical discussions. This is a different thing about, I mean, I don't want to say anything about the status of, I don't want to say much about the status of the theories themselves. I mean, I can say very briefly. To me, the theories themselves, I mean, they have empirical consequences, but we don't use empirical evidence or empirical methodologies. So although they have empirical consequences and some empirical consequences dispose or at least put serious problems for some philosophical theories. We just try to provide, as it were, rational reconstructions of what is behind these concepts that we use in these cases. And given that, I think that one should be very skeptical about the real truth of the theories themselves. So my own take about the theories themselves is very fictionalist. I assimilate these things and everything that I have said about to the hermeneutics, to the interpretation of fictions. So you could have a difficult, complicated fiction like Mulholland Drive, or last year in Marienbad, and so you could say the same thing. You get exposed yourself to theories, interpretations of these films, apparently disagreeing theories that provide totally different theories. So, and if they are good, so they at least they point out to the facts. So there are facts about the films or the stories that any good theory should take into consideration, explain, account for. So it's not that anything goes, but in any interesting case, there will be a plurality of theories that make sense in different ways, moving the pieces here and there of the stories. And so I would say the same thing that I have said about the phenomenology of understanding. If you think of your state about how to understand Mulholland Drive before going through these theories, and after, clearly you have won a lot of understanding, but that doesn't mean that you should stick to any of these theories. Even if you stick to one for personal reasons, because that's the one that you like and makes better sense of everything. But it's not clear at all that you could say that is that true theory. It's a good story to tell about that. So that is my line about the theories themselves. But in going, thinking about them and considering, I mean, for this reason, it's good to be pluralistic and it's good to be exposed to different stories, to different theories. And it's even better if you could use the history of philosophy. I mean, if you can use theories that use very different conceptual resources that you have to do if you go through the history of philosophy, because that would produce this gaining understanding but it would be not very rational in my view to stick your neck for one of them, given the resources that we have. That's my line. There is a lot of understanding to be won by going through philosophical theories, but that doesn't mean that one of them has to be true or sensible to vote for one.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. Yeah, so I think I'll end the questions there. Thanks so much for being here, Professor Garcia-Carpintero, and taking my questions. And it's been great. It's been great having you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you for your questions.